Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, anybody who's just recently joined, or was everybody there at Sister Shivani's address? So what did we basically learn about? Switching off our minds, all about mental health, mental wellness. And if you're talking about wellness, if you have your visiting cards, I can still take them, because you might win yourself something very fabulous. We have Suniji, who's already won a Da Milano bag. And there's another draw which is going to happen in the evening. And I have the fish bowl for that. Would also like to thank our sponsor for the lunch, the delicious lunch we had, the Unity family. And a big thank you to the CEO interim, Mr. Inderjeet Kamotra ji, for hosting that lunch for us. Yeah, we should have a round of applause. देखिए, अच्छा खाना हमेशा applause आना चाहिए उसके लिए. Okay, so I do team building sessions, and there's something that we do as an energizer. So after COVID, you know, everybody gets into a very different mode. Even when we are sitting, the body language is different, right? So we're going to do an energizer. Energizer is plain and simple. We need to bring out the X factor, right? So right hand, sabhi right hand aage, right hand, yes, right hand aage. And left hand aage, dono, right? Do that, right hand, left hand. All right. So one's the destiny and one's the karma. सिस्टर शिवानी जी भी बोल रही थी कि कर्म करने चाहिए, बट कुछ प्रारब्ध आपका पहले से आता है. तो डेस्टिनी एंड कर्मा, राइट इज द डेस्टिनी, सॉरी, राइट इज द कर्मा एंड लेफ्ट इज द डेस्टिनी. Once you combine them together, they have to match a wavelength. So there comes a point which is called the crisscross factor. X bana lijiye, right? And then they have to face each other to take the right decisions, and they have to come together, right? जोर से, हाँ, बिल्कुल जोर से, सब बिल्कुल सही कर रहे हैं आप. हाँ, सो जोर से जैसे ही आप कर्मा करते हैं और आप कहते हैं कि मैं स्वस्थ हूं, बोले I am a karma yodha and I believe in righteous living. So everything turns around. क्या हुआ? नहीं हुआ? Okay, the secret I'll tell you later. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, एक बारी फिर से हम लेके आते हैं Aatmanirbhar Bharat. Will it slow or hasten our integration into global supply chains? Please put your hands together for welcoming our esteemed group of panelists, none other than Mr. Shishir Priyadarshi, Director WTO Geneva. Zordar taaliyan. Come on, let's have it for them. Mr. Manish Sharma, Chairman and CEO, Panasonic India and South Asia. Mr. Ranu Vora, co-founder and executive vice chairman of Vendis Capital, and our moderator, associate editor and anchor CNBC TV 18, Mr. Ashmit Kumar. Zordar taaliyan. Come on, they need this.
I think all credit to the MC for bringing back a lot of energy post-lunch. I think that's always a little tricky after having had a meal, but all credit to him. With that, a very good afternoon to all of us gathered here. Thank you so much for being a part of this, as well as our panelists who've taken out their precious time. I think we have a very interesting subject on our hands. I was just reading up a little before coming here. And it's interesting that in the last quarter 4 of 2021, the issue of global supply chains was mentioned over 2.2 million times on Twitter. In fact, we have an interesting New York-based comedian, Orly Matlow. She, in fact, said it's entered popular culture now, the issue of global supply chains. In one of her shows, she said that the reason she's single is because of global supply chain issues. So there's clearly, this issue is really at the heart of a number of issues that we talk about on a daily basis. I think at some point it does go back to global supply chain issues. We're hoping to discuss that here. Aatmanirbhar Bharat, will it slow or hasten our integration into global supply chain? It's an interesting subject. It has multiple aspects and facets to it. I think without wasting any time, let's go across to some of our panelists. Mr. Shishir, if I may come across to you first. Opening thoughts. It's a very interesting subject. Aatmanirbhar campaign launched in 2020. What is your assessment of how this has been perceived and what this is likely to translate into?
Sure. Thanks, Ashmit, and pleasure to be here. Look, the question that is before this on this session, that will Aatmanirbharta actually help or slow down our integration into global value chains, trust me, is on the lips of many in the international community. You know, when the Aatmanirbharta scheme was announced by the Prime Minister in May of 2020, and look, I'm based outside, I'm with the WTO in Geneva, there were many people who felt that was it in part taking us back to the pre-90 days of, protectionism leading to supporting the domestic industry. Now, really, the apple or the truth is always in the way you eat the pudding. There is, at the moment, if I just in brief tell you globally, two very strong thoughts when they look at India. India is obviously a very, very important destination, and the more certainty and predictability that Indian policy can provide, the more likely you will get investment, and therefore more likely you will get technology and therefore competitiveness. But the two questions, Ashmit, that are being asked is that will this be implemented with an outward focus, a focus which will encourage exports, but encourage exports by increasing domestic manufacturing capacity, by ensuring that domestic industry becomes competitive. Because the only way you can integrate into any existing global value chain is if you can provide them very clearly that you will produce what others are producing more competitively and more efficiently. But there are an equal number of critics who perhaps are questioning that is this another word for self-reliance, for closing the doors, and for creating barriers in the guise of national national economic growth. So the difference, people would be watching what India does very clearly. And I probably have more to say as we go on, but just one small data fact. In the last year and a half, or last about 2 years, overall average tariffs within India have gone up. Now, whether that's a temporary phenomena just to provide some relief to domestic industry, or whether it is a trend of things to come, I think it's extremely important for policymakers in India to be very, very aware that this will really be the make or break between integrating into global value chains or not. And I end with just kind of one strong emphasis for a lot of you here. Today, 70% of global trade is part of global value chains. And if we are not integrated into it, we're losing a big pie. Thanks.
That's an interesting global perspective. Mr. Sharma, let me come to you as an industry participant. You, of course, have an insider's perspective on what the last 2 years have meant. So your quick take, your opening remarks on Aatmanirbharta in integrating with global supply chain.
Sure, thank you. So my perspective is, as the name suggests, Aatmanirbhar, so self-reliance, as it says, does not mean disengaging from the global supply chains. It means integrating at our own terms. So what has happened in last couple of years, if we look at first what has happened in last 7 to 8 years, and you spoke about significant increase in tariffs in lot of items which we used to import. So that has happened in a phased manner in last 7 to 8 years, part of the phased manufacturing program which started in 2014-15. The intention was to create an inverted duty structure which temporarily sets off the disability of the cost which exists of the manufacturing in the country comparative to the other manufacturing economies. Now, what has happened in last couple of years is we have taken a structured approach to take 3 important steps in the coming decade, looking towards 2030. First is to let the assembly of goods which we consume in the country to happen in the country. But this is not enough. Then we have to look at increasing the value addition and also ensure that we enable backward integration and not only assemble the goods which we consume in the country, but we produce the components also within the country. And third, the ultimate objective is leverage on the scale merit of our country, create economies of scale, make ourselves competitive on a global scale, and then enable exports. So this is the strategy which has come into force. A lot of deliberations have happened, and under DPIIT, the scale committee was formed to drive this agenda of Aatmanirbhar Bharat. And industry captains and people from the government has come together to enable a structured dialogue, a phased dialogue to enable Aatmanirbhar Bharat in the coming years. That has happened in the last couple of years.
That's interesting. Mr. Vora, of course, any form of integration that needs to take place will be impossible without the required capital. So if I were to come to you and speak to you as to how global capital is looking at the evolution of Aatmanirbharta or self-reliance and what that translates into for the global value chain integration, your quick thoughts on how global capital looks at this?
Sure. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. So, hearing about self-reliance, Aatmanirbharta brings two things to my mind. For a long period of time, Aatmanirbharta, self-reliance was about energy requirements and capital flows. Two important parts which drive an economy, oil and economy, are these two parts. It's only lately, the last few years, we started talking about Aatmanirbharta even in traditional manufacturing kind of industries. To give you a sense, almost, China, if you look at China today, if you look across industry segments, China contributes anywhere between 35 to 95% of the global value in industries, right? In certain industries like solar glass, it's extremely high. In other industries, it's low. So the whole concept of self-reliance, Aatmanirbharta, I think has to be taken with a very measured, in a very measured way. It is not something which can be overnight brought in. It's a good direction to take, but as a destination, Aatmanirbharta is way off. And I'll tell you the inherent contradiction in that, right? Today, if I go to United States of America, and United States of America becomes very insular and stops taking any kind of talent from India in the garb of saying we want to be self-reliant, I don't think India, we will be sitting back feeling happy about it. I'm sure there is going to be, you have hundreds of billions of dollars of value lying in IT services today. So the concept of self-reliance has to be taken in the context of what has happened in the last 3 or 4 decades. We cannot undo that. Globalization was a train which left the station, and it is very unlikely, in my view, despite the current geopolitics, that globalization will be rolled back. I think self-reliance has to be taken in certain perspectives and has to be taken in certain industries. There are industries where having high quality talent, engineering talent, specialized chemists, all of that will help us in being, able to service our local market. The one thing which Manish mentioned, which I think is very relevant, is it is also a sign of coming of age in terms of scale and capacity in India. You can only be self-reliant if you have something, a local market, some basic production which can take care of the local market before taking care of the exports. Sure. So in some manner, what we are saying today is that this is coming from a theme that we today have large enough scale, both from a consumption and business perspective, that we can talk of self-reliance. Just one part on capital, which you, Ashmeet, mentioned, and which I should touch upon. I should give some facts to the audience here. There was a huge amount of panic in the capital markets in the last 1 year. People started saying we are losing foreign investment. Foreign investment started going out of India. As much as $60 to $70 billion were lost in a period of 8 to 9 months. What happened to the markets? The markets were down only 5 to 10%. And now they are back to normal. So in some manner, I take this as a sign that even though Aatmanirbharta in other things is is just coming. In financial services, it's real. You can see it, that despite so much money going out of India, the domestic capital was enough to keep the market steady and not volatile and shaking.
It's interesting that you mentioned the markets. The markets, in fact, the Nifty breached 18,000 yesterday. I think Sensex is above 60,000. So there is that optimism, it seems, at least as far as foreign capital is concerned. But in terms of global value chain, in terms of execution issues, Mr. Sharma, let me come to you. We've seen a lot of headway being made, let's say, for instance, in the mobile industry. And it's in reference to that industry that I'd like to ask you the next question. ICRIER introduced, very recently came out with their report where they said, globalize before localize. The push being that there needs to be a sequential series of steps. The first one being developing scale, exporting, and then subsequently asking for local value addition. Your quick take on that.
So both will go hand in hand. You need to create economies of scale. Take instance, of course, mobile is one example. We are already witnessing immense growth and hence scales. If you look at another example of air conditioner, which was also part of the 14 sectors which were identified for the production-linked incentive schemes, look at the potential which exists in our country. So today, when you look at data, the penetration rate of air conditioners in the country is just about 6% of the households. The size of our market is about 7.5 to 8 million units annually. China produces 120 million air conditioners annually. Out of that, they export 50 million. They consume 80 million in the country. That is the potential in our country. When it comes to value addition, we do a value addition of only about 20% locally in air conditioners. So in that sense, there is so much to achieve in the years to come. And when scale gets created, they eventually help create backward integration. Because today the disability can be only countered by multiple means. And this PLI is potentially a sort of a crutch which will exist for next 4 to 5 years. But then we have to create our own competitiveness. So therefore, going global, simultaneously creating backward integration, making our products competitive both on cost and quality, I think this will go hand in hand in the coming years.
Mr. Priyadarshi, a quick word from you as far as the PLI scheme is concerned. We've seen PLIs being introduced across 14 sectors. And I'd like to ask you this again in context of that ICRIER report, which said that let this be a two-step process. The first one being exposure to the outside world, more exports, and then subsequent to that, having more localization here. Just your quick take on that lens, globalize before localize, at the PLI schemes.
Look, I think the key word is whether we want to make in India or whether we want to make for the world. This is really I think you've got to be so clear. Because finally, Ashmit, there is one very important thing if you want to integrate into global value chains, and that relates to your domestic manufacturing and the encouragement through PLIs. Today, you cannot be part of global value chains without a very, very strong trade facilitation policy. And by a trade facilitation policy, I mean a policy that genuinely facilitates imports. We can make any kind of political speeches about the importance of India integrated into global value chains. But two essential criteria, if not fulfilled, will just simply not help. The first is, as I said, if 70% of global trade is in intermediaries, then without importing, you can't export. Sure, you import, then you add what the PLI schemes and other schemes have helped you produce domestically, and then you import. The second absolute essential thing is technology oblique competitiveness. You know, we talk a lot about ease of doing business. And that's essential. And I know India is going up in those figures a lot. I genuinely think its time has come now for us to start talking about cost of doing business. Ease of doing business, fine. We are taking away barriers. What about the cost? If we do not ensure cutting costs, then any amount of, the globalization. So in my view, yes, you need to look outwards, but while supporting inwards to the extent without creating barriers towards outwards. Sorry, that's a convoluted thing, but that's the way I look at it.
I think you raised a very interesting point about what trade deals and the FTA pacts here and the impact that they could have. Well, we'll circle back to that in just a bit. We'll put a pin on that for now. But Mr. Vora, coming to you again, we raised the subject of PLIs. What is your assessment of the PLI schemes, the way they fared so well in terms of allowing that kind of integration? The reason I ask this is that while certain PLIs have been hugely successful, we've seen huge numbers coming out of the mobile production industry, there are others that have been a little more perhaps circumspect in terms of seeking perhaps greater incentives from the government. Your quick take on this PLI push as a part of the Aatmanirbhar Bharat campaign?
I think it's a support which the industry needed at a particular point of time, continues to need at a point of time. I think we are dealing with a situation where we are trying to create a China plus one world, right? I think the China plus one world, that plus one applies to India, right? I think it's very hard to find a country which can substitute that plus one. So if that is the assumption you make, then you look at different industries. For instance, specifically in electronic manufacturing, and I'm not taking mobile phones for a moment here. I'm talking of simple consumer durable, washing machines, air conditioners, refrigerators. Simple manufacturing like that itself, in my mind, has been a big beneficiary, both in terms of revenues being created and values being created for such companies in the market. The second place where we think that there could potentially that could help is something like the textile industry. I think there are already kind of murmurs and the right kind of buzz in the textile industry. That is again something where we have lost not just to China or Southeast Asia, but even to our neighbors, right, in terms of capacity building. So I think there again we are seeing that over a period of time we see PLI benefiting. So consumer durables and textiles is an area. The other area where we have natural talent available and we think something might happen sooner than later is specialty chemicals. So these three areas I think are, in my mind, looking like large beneficiaries already.
Mr. Sharma, you're a ready participant as far as these PLI schemes are concerned. You've been partaking in these incentive schemes. Your quick assessment, you think there's a need for perhaps a greater fiscal push in terms of more areas being covered and more incentive being put out for the industry?
That can always be an expectation from the industry. And when the deliberations were going on, we were assessing that how should we set the right understanding on the disability which exists and to what extent this percentage of PLI should be applied. So industry always wishes that as much as it can be, but it was set to just about 5% to start with, and I think it will average at about 4% in over a period of 5 years. And another very good example of the success it witnessed, for example, in the mobile industry is air conditioners. I would be kind of repetitive on that. But if you look at the speed at which the policy was formed, and I was also a party to that conversation in my capacity being chair with the FICCI's Electronics Committee. So from the point where the conversation started and a vision which we took that we will take air conditioners industry from the current level of 16,000 crores to 1 lakh crore of revenue, and from a current level of 20% value addition, we'll take it up to 80% in next 3 to 4 years. With that vision, we created this framework and draft of how the PLI scheme should look like. From the starting point to the announcement of the scheme, it took just about 7 months of time. And then from there till receiving the applications, it took just about 45 days. And we received applications worth 6,600 crores of investments against an allocation of 6,200 crores of budget for the air conditioners and the LED lights industry. That has been the speed. And while we talk, in just about 4 to 5 months, investments worth 800 crores have already happened on the ground to enable backward integration. And I believe, answering once again your question of how we should look at the future of integration, I think the very nature of integration will start to change. So countries may have to look beyond being an importer and exporter. So we are looking at complete change in the supply chain. On supply side, you will look at more partnerships to happen, especially in the small and medium enterprises, where we will enable the component manufacturing to happen in our country. So in that sense, we are engaging with people who have access to technology elsewhere. And when it comes to demand side, we are no longer going to look at only export of these bulky products to happen out of our country, because logistics cost will not let that happen in the first instance. And there is so much of protectionism which will cut across other nations also. So we have to also look at a sort of a hub and spoke model where we become technology provider and we create hub and spoke models of supplies in other countries also. So I think that is going to change in next few years.
Interesting. Let's change the direction a little bit. Mr. Priyadarshi, to come to you, one of the issues that you red flagged was perhaps how perhaps FTA route and trade deals is one area where we can in fact actively work for ensuring greater integration. We've seen a lot of headway being made in the UAE, a lot of headway sought to be made in the GCC countries, Australia. We're trying with the UK, US as well. Is that the way forward?
You're actually taking away some of the steam from a session to follow. We have a session on regionalism versus multilateralism a little later in the afternoon. But no, look, I mean, in a synoptic manner and keeping more of that steam for that session, I think both these will have to learn to coexist. Globalization always felt that regionalism would be a building block. Countries which perhaps were hesitant to open up initially globally could open up on a regional basis and then take the next step. But in some ways, the mushrooming of bilateral and regional arrangements, instead of becoming a building block, are gradually becoming a stumbling block to multilateralism. And though the causal factor is difficult to say, was it because of lack of decision making at the multilateral level that led to these? But more in the context of India, I think the more burning issue that I've been reading since the last 2 days is India has decided to opt out of the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. Now, I think opting out of the RCEP was probably easier to explain because, I mean, from an Indian perspective, that it has China and, you're probably opening up your markets, though already your markets are open. But I think not being a signatory to the, especially the trade pillar of the IPAF is slightly more baffling.
It's interesting. Mr. Vora, your thoughts on that? It's been an interesting time that we've seen India's shown a lot of gumption, being very bullish on some of these FTAs. UAE in particular, we were there for covering the Dubai Expo as well. Mr. Piyush Goyal was also there. But we've seen perhaps a little more, the government being a little more circumspect as far as the Indo-Pacific region is concerned. Just your assessment of how these regional treaties come into play for investment in India.
I think our assessment, having conversations with entrepreneurs in the manufacturing, chemicals, some of the spaces which would be relevant here, is that this is not a primary issue in the short to medium term for most entrepreneurs. This is something directionally a long-term move, which will give strength, which will give, probably put bigger markets at play, give some preferential access, but purely from the current problems, current priorities, I think it is not a very big issue for most entrepreneurs in India. It doesn't come out in any of our roundtables as a big issue at the moment, purely from an entrepreneurial perspective.
That's an interesting insight coming in. Mr. Sharma, let me come to you now. We've been speaking of the China +1 strategy. India is, of course, positioning itself to benefit from that strategy as companies try to build more resilience, countries try to build more resilience in their supply chains. Are we there yet? Or are we competing with Vietnam, beating them as a part of that +1 strategy?
It'll take some time. We have just started off. The thought process has become much more, it considers much more aspects of where do we want to position ourselves long term. When we will look back in time in the history, we may challenge our own decisions that why did we stay away from these large blocks? There's a possibility. But I think we are trying to carve our own way. And there is a long way to go. I mean, if I give you our own example of Panasonic, today we operate out of 78 or 79 factories in China. And we have just about 25 to 26 factories in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia. And we have invested into 16 factories in our country. Out of those 16 factories, 7 or 8 have come out in the last decade. So that is the speed at which we are making investments in the country. So we are kind of catching up. This is an example of our organization, and so is the case with the industry at large. And I personally believe that we are at the cusp of expansion, explosion, exponential expansion of demand in our country, which potentially is due for last many, many years. And the coming decade will be full of opportunities. So therefore, we will do our own part of catch-up in the coming decade, looking towards 2030. So we have just started off. We are not there yet. And it is very natural to assume that we are competing with countries like Vietnam. So we have to have a structured approach. Yes, of course, we are going to leverage on our biggest potential, which is the demand itself. So the big question is, how do we unlock that potential? That is one. And second is, how do we do away with the existing disabilities? Because in some sense, Vietnam is sitting on the ASEAN bloc. So they have their own set of advantages. So on one side, we have to open up opportunities outside our country. And therefore, I said that when we will look back in history, we may end up challenging our decisions which we are making to stay away from large blocks today. But I think the potential within the country is huge. And then there is an opportunity with the bilateral and the multilateral agreements which we are now looking at.
So there's great potential. Mr. Priyadarshi, coming to you, you've expressed some concern that while there is potential, the regional blocks are turning out to be more of a stumbling block as far as multilateralism is concerned. Let me add another dynamic for you, geopolitics. That's something I think is weighing heavily on the minds of policymakers as they begin to make geostrategic economic decisions. Your quick thoughts on that in terms of impact on the global supply chains?
Sure. I think you raise a very, very important point. You know, if I look 20 years back, India actually spearheaded a small group in Geneva called the Friends of the Multilateral Trading System, which strongly opposed any bilateral agreement. Today, India is very much pushing, and I must say in some ways also looking westwards, because some of our initial 16 or 17 FTAs were all, you know, more to the east. But what I would say is a clear discerning trend globally is that political / strategic relations are guiding economic relations. For many, many years, economic relations would guide it. But today, political and strategic relations are guiding economic relations. So very clearly in the context of India too, what you're seeing is India gradually and very strongly pushing their economic partnership agreements with those countries with which it would also want to create a strategic relationship. Whether we look at, whatever we are doing with the US, Australia, Japan, as now part of actually 2 Quads, I think this is all geared towards strengthening your political relationships through a parallel, very strong economic bloc. But this is a global trend, and I think India is very much part of it, and it probably also kind of, counters what was being said about the China plus one. So yes, a very important trend and a trend to stay, but a trend which will have to be followed. And sorry for one more minute. You may not agree with everything that the other side wants, but very often we as Indian negotiators, we put our requests on the table, but are not willing to accept that, so there will always be this dichotomy between challenges and opportunities. Every economic agreement would create both. We'd prefer only opportunities.
It's interesting. You've given a very interesting and succinct teaser to what is to follow. The next the session dealing with regionalism versus multilateralism. But we're running out of time. We're at the end of this discussion with about 5 more minutes left. I'll come to all the panelists. Mr. Vora, to you first. In terms of taking this journey forward, in ensuring that Aatmanirbharta work towards integration of India with the global value chain, what would your request or perhaps suggestion be to the government in terms of either extending the benefits that have so far been extended, or perhaps looking at newer areas to cover?
I think the first thing is to identify in a very focused way the areas where Aatmanirbharta can have an impact. I was referred to a report by a leading consulting company, which out of a universe of 70 areas and sectors came down to about 6 sectors whether it is, for instance, semiconductors, whether it is defense. So one, there needs to be a complete narrowing of focus from an Aatmanirbharta perspective. Trying to do everything in a very broad brush manner, I don't think is going to be very useful. Once you've identified those 6 subsectors or sectors, which hopefully are large enough, then coming with very specific incentives, plans, capital, which those sectors might require. I think capital is as important to make sure, because these are things in the nature of subsidies. So there is some allocation which needs to be made to these industries, specific industries. And I think once that part is done, then how does that have to be positioned to the community? How is, in the words of one of my panelists, it's the cost of doing business. How do you ultimately manage the cost of doing business specific to those sectors and make it attractive for entrepreneurs to put in risk capital is something which I would go in for.
Mr. Sharma, final comments that you mentioned that the total value addition that we do, giving the examples of ACs, it's at 20%. How do we take it higher?
Yeah, it's happening actually. I think the onus is with the industry now. So taking forward from where Mr. Vora left, so 14 sectors, for example, which are identified. So now we have to ensure that those steps are taken in next 5 years. And I think the onus is with the industry now. So we have to enable technology partnerships, because access to technology for a lot of those items, compressors, motors, heat exchangers, copper tubing, timers, and PCBAs, the laminates itself. So a structured approach is needed for next 5 to 10 years to enable those technology partnerships. So both on the supply and the demand side, I think a lot of micro effort has to happen in the way forward, and neither the government nor the industry should leave it here. And second is that we have to seriously look at unlocking the potential of the demand which exists in the country. And a lot of people like me would have been repetitive on this, but it is up to the council to decide that should the GST continue what it is today. And if you look at air conditioners, it is 28%, and no longer categories like air conditioners are luxury items. They have almost become a necessity, and so is the case with a lot of other products. So those kind of tactical initiatives. On strategic level, I think the framework is made in a structured manner, but we have to now handhold the industry to enable those tiny steps for it to become competitive in next 5 to 10 years' time.
It's interesting you mentioned GST. Another concern that has in fact very often come from the industry is one point that Mr. Priyadarshi had made with respect to tariffs that were imposing on a lot of key imported items for in fact building in India, for making in India. We're almost out of time, Mr. Priyadarshi. A quick word from you in terms of what would be that one suggestion or one advice that you will give to the government in terms of building Aatmanirbharta.
Let me give 3, but do it in the time that it would take to give 1. Have a GVC policy. We have an industrial policy, we have a trade policy, elements of which have GVC. High time India had a GVC policy. Second, don't just listen to business, act on what business says. We do a lot of consultations, but very often what is finally put forward in international fora is not reflecting that. So don't just listen to business, act on business. And third, extremely important, be very aware that it is not political statements or policies which will attract investments, it's the actions. And that is where what we said about lower tariffs, facilitate imports, look outwards, produce for the world, even though it's produced in India. 3 suggestions, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Priyadarshi. I think we're very close to ending the time that we were allotted for this panel discussion. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I think we've had a very interesting discussion with a lot of insights that perhaps we can take away from here and then subsequently build on that for perhaps hopefully the next edition of the Mind Summit when we will meet again. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts with us. Mr. Vora, Mr. Priyadarshi, Mr. Sharma, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
As well as Mr. Munjal.
I would request you to please be seated because the discussion was so enlightening. We have a question for the audience. So if you remember, I had given you those devices for voting. Can we have the poll question, please? Okay, yeah, this is how it is supposed to be used. If you see the way, you will get options A, B, C, and D. Press long the CE button to switch it on. सी बटन को दबाएंगे तो स्विच ऑन हो जाएगा, बट थोड़ा लॉन्ग प्रेस करना पड़ेगा आपको. उसके बाद जैसे ही सवाल आप देखते हैं, द मोमेंट यू सी द क्वेश्चन, यू विल गेट एन ऑप्शन A, B, C, D, E. Whichever the option you think is fine, press on that, but you have to press the OK button, which is the green signal that you see on the top right. Right? So can we have the question, please? Self-sufficiency in manufacturing will help India integrate with global supply chains faster. A for agree, B for disagree, and C for can't say. So these are the live polls that you get to see right now. After you've chosen A, B, or C, you must press OK. That is the green cursor that you see. Okay, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. We are very much in agreement with the poll. Can we have a round of applause for this session? Thank you. Would request none other than Founder and Secretary General Kutch, Mr. Pradeep Mehta, to kindly grace the stage and present the memento to our esteemed group of panelists. Mr. Mehta. Zordar Taliyan, let's have it for sir.